Welcome to Women in Shakespeare, Women on Shakespeare, hosted by the Shakespeare Society of India, is soon to commemorate the 459th birth anniversary of the Bard. In 2023, the world also marks the 400th anniversary of the first folio, a monumental project put together by Shakespeare's fellow actors John Hemming and Henry Condell 7 years after his death. In The History of Sexuality, Michel Foucault commented that sexuality must not be thought of as a kind of natural given which power tries to hold in check, or as an obscure domain which knowledge tries gradually to uncover. It is the name that can be given to a historical construct, not a furtive reality that is difficult to grasp, but a great surface network in which the stimulation of bodies, the intensification of pleasures, the incitement to discourse, the formation of special knowledges, the strengthening of controls and resistances are linked to one another in accordance with the few major strategies of knowledge and power. Certainly in Shakespeare studies there can be no doubt that feminist criticism has been enormously influential in putting issues of sexuality and sexual differences onto the critical agenda. In this context, Women in Shakespeare, Women on Shakespeare will try to explore the socio-political conditioning that have contributed towards Shakespeare's creation of his women characters and responses of female critics over the years. It is both a pleasure and privilege to welcome Professor Yogesh Dubey, officiating President of SSI New Delhi, to begin the event with his introductory address.
Hello everyone. It's a matter of great joy and happiness that on the occasion of Shakespeare's 459th birth anniversary, the Shakespeare Society of India East Zone is organizing its annual Shakespeare anniversary event under the title Women in Shakespeare, Women on Shakespeare. No denying that the title of the event is luring enough. While focusing on Shakespeare's women, one realizes Shakespeare has all kinds of women in his plays, and that they have drawn the attention of audience and critics from different races, moments and milieus. Either it be his tragedies, comedies, history plays or problem plays, we come across different shots of women. His women can broadly be categorized into two domains. The one in which we can place the women who speak less and follow the social system blindly without questioning it and accepting their suffering calmly as their fate. In the other domain, we can place the women who speak, question, and challenge the system fearlessly. It is through his speaking women that Shakespeare may be seen as promoting women for raising their voices against their marginalization and objectification by the social system that treats them only as the other and the object and not as subject and self. Shakespeare's raising of women's issues through his plays and on his stage in a time when women's roles were to be played not by female but by male actors makes him look like a bard free from biases against women. While switching from women In Shakespeare, too, Women on Shakespeare, one is reminded of a number of women, scholars and writers. And among these, Charlotte Lennox, daughter of the female Quixote, reserves a very significant place, especially due to her groundbreaking work on Shakespeare, which is recorded in 3 volumes of her Shakespeare Illustrated, or the novels and histories on which the plays of Shakespeare are founded. Critically examining Shakespeare's plays, she asserts that Shakespeare did not invent his plots. Rather, they were adopted and adapted from the prior existing plots. She does not confine herself only to the source study of Shakespeare's plays, rather, she also speaks her mind whenever she finds him unconvincing in plot adaptation. She comments on Shakespeare's genius also and puts forward her observations on the limitations of Shakespeare's characterization. It is not that Lennox does not value Shakespeare's contribution to the English stage. For example, when it comes to her reflections on Macbeth, she praises it as a beautiful piece by Shakespeare. With this much, I congratulate the SSI East Zone for organizing the Shakespeare Anniversary event and strongly believe that the event would be fruitful, interesting and a great success. With all best wishes. Thank you.
Now, Professor Barang Faruqi, Secretary SSI, New Delhi, will deliver a few words of introduction and a couple of readings.
Hello everyone. Once again I begin by congratulating the East Zone of Shakespeare Society of India for once again coming up with an ingenious idea of celebrating Shakespeare's birth anniversary. This time their topic is Women in Shakespeare and Women on Shakespeare. I must say the topic is very interesting, and Dr. Naina Day needs to be congratulated for coming up with such an ingenious topic and for constantly reminding me that I need to send my two-bit entry or whatever you call it, the video, as Secretary of the Shakespeare Society of India. So here goes. I thought about speaking on women on Shakespeare, but then I somehow couldn't bring myself to do that because I have this intense relationship with some of Shakespeare's women characters, and I thought that I'll look at a couple of them, or at least 3 of them. And so women in Shakespeare is what I'm going to be. Enobapus, I will tell you, the barge she sat in like a burnished throne burned on the water. The poop was beaten gold, purple the sails, and so perfumed that the winds were lovesick with them. The oars were silver, which to the tune of flutes kept stroke, and made the water which they beat to follow faster, as amorous of their strokes. For her own person, it beggared all description. She did lie in her pavilion, cloth of gold, of tissue, o'erpicturing that Venus where we see the fancy outwork nature. On each side her stood pretty dimpled boys like smiling cupids with divers coloured fans, whose wind did seem to glow the delicate cheeks which they did cool, and what they undid did. So this is the kind of description that Shakespeare has given us of Cleopatra. So Miranda is another very cute little girl who's barely 16, or maybe some critics call her 15 years old, when she sets eyes upon Ferdinand. And of course, Prospero's already, poured the magic potion into the air, and they're bound to fall in love with each other. But she is shown to be making her own choice, and she falls so very, headlong into love with Ferdinand that she kind of starts criticizing her father. And when her father makes Ferdinand carry logs, punishes him and says, I don't trust this man, he's an imposter, he seems to be a fake imposter kind. So she feels so bad that her father's behaving so badly, and she even offers to carry the logs for him. She says, if you'll sit down, I'll bear your logs the while. Pray give me that. I'll carry it to the pile. So, and Ferdinand says, no, precious creature. So you have this Miranda, who's not set her eyes upon another man except for Caliban and her father Prospero, and who's so outgoing, and she offers herself in marriage without asking her father. So here's to all the women in Shakespeare. They're all lovely.
Coming up is Dr. Jolly Das, Associate Professor, Department of English, Vidyasagar University, who will deliver a lecture on Are They Women? Gender Performance in Cross-Dressed Women Characters in Shakespeare's Comedies.
The title of my talk is Are They Women? Gender Performance in Cross-Dressed Women Characters in Shakespeare's Comedies. In Shakespeare's gallery of women, there are 6 roles which call a young female character to dress herself temporarily in the clothes of a man. They have recently drawn the attention of those attempting to recover his awareness of and participation in Elizabethan constructions of gender. 2 of the 6 parts, Portia or Balthazar and Nerissa or the clerk, occur in The Merchant of Venice, and of those 2, only Portia is fully developed. The remaining parts are those of Julia or Sebastian in Two Gentlemen of Verona, Rosalind or Ganymede in As You Like It, Viola or Cesario in Twelfth Night, and Imogen or Fidele in Cymbeline. A significant number of recent cultural histories, as well as culturally based readings of Elizabethan texts, have focused attention on what Harley Granville Barker first called the boy actress as one of the keys to understanding the formation and propagation of sex gender differences in Renaissance social and artistic transactions. For some recent feminist historians, male control of both the writing and playing of female parts to, among others, homosexual spectators, in a culture increasingly repressive of women's rights and freedom, has foreclosed further inquiry into what they regard as monolithically patriarchal drama and theatre. Other commentators continue to look closely at theatrical texts and practices on the assumption that while contained within a patriarchy, the Elizabethan theatre, nevertheless, could prompt its spectators to reflect critically upon its performance of cultural institutions, including the performance of gender roles. Jean Howard says that how many people cross dressed in Renaissance England? Howard posed this intriguing question, suggesting that disruption of the semiotics of dress, gender, and identity during the late Elizabethan and early Jacobean periods points to a sex gender system under pressure and a patriarchal culture disturbed by profound anxieties and contradictions. Even if the answer to her questions turns out to be very few, the discourse surrounding the practice reveals an area of critical and problematic unease. Female transvestism on the streets of London, male transvestism on the stage, and vituperative attacks on cross dressing by Protestant reformers are among the symptoms that indicate that the subversive or transgressive potential of this practice could be and was recuperated in a number of ways. Whether in real life or in literature, cross dressing involved struggle, resistance, and subversion, as well as modification, recuperation, and containment of the system of gendered patriarchal domination. 2 types of cross dressing have recently caught the attention of literary scholars. First, the women To be specific, prostitutes of Renaissance England who began adopting masculine attire, and second, the boys and young men who took female parts and dressed in female costume in the course of dramatic performances on stage. The first is represented as a challenge to patriarchal values, a bold assault on oppressive cultural boundaries. The second as marking the sexual ambivalence, androgyny, and muted eroticism linking actors, dramatists, and playgoers in a sexually charged subculture of transgression. Both phenomena were disturbing to moralists and reformers, and both offer interpretative opportunities to modern cultural critics. Not surprisingly, they open avenues to politicized discourse about sexuality, self representation, and gender that has become increasingly fashionable. Linda Woolbridge has identified not simply isolated and ambiguous cases of women masking in men's weeds, but a full blown female transvestite movement in early modern England. Its indications were everywhere, she finds, not just in literary polemic and satire, but in real life too, becoming a fairly permanent feature of the Jacobean landscape. Women dressed as men, Woodbridge suggests, for a variety of admirable reasons to plead at law, regain a fortune, or practice a profession barred to women, to advance a stratagem, win back lovers, or fight a duel, to travel alone, avoid rape or molestation, and to have adventures. The cross dressed women in this rendition were bold and ingenious, their actions commendably shrewd. Let us look at how some women critics have seen the representation of these issues in Shakespeare's plays, particularly the comedies where women characters resorted to cross dressing as men. Laura Levine in Men in Women's Clothing, Anti Theatricality and Effeminization from 1579 to 1642 points out that sometime in 1579, in a pamphlet which was to establish the terms of attack and defense for another 60 years, Stephen Gosson made the curious remark that theatre effeminated the mind. 4 years later, in a pamphlet twice the size, Philip Stubbs clarified this claim even as he heightened it by insisting that male actors who wore women's clothing could literally adulterate male gender. 50 years later, in a 1,000-page tract which may have hastened the closing of the theatres, William Prynne described a man whom women's clothing had literally caused to degenerate into a woman. In the years of mounting pamphlet war about the stage, the vague sense that theatre could somehow soften the responses of the audience had been replaced by the fear, expressed in virtually biological terms, that theatre could structurally transform men into women. In the light of this, Levine asks, how can we account for this fear of effeminization? It at once seems irrational and tends to endow theatre with magical properties. The idea that a man can be turned into a woman is a version of the more basic magical idea that one person can be turned into another. But what model of a self would one have to maintain that idea? That assumption, Levine argues, is a tacit belief in the primacy of the will, and this is exactly what seems to have been disarmed in anti theatrical tracts. This is a self which can always be altered not by its own playful shaping intelligence, but by malevolent forces outside its control. In fact, the model of the self implicitly held by anti theatricalists is profoundly contradictory, for, according to its logic, the self is both inherently monstrous and inherently nothing at all. To manage this contradiction, the men who held this model of the self seemed to project it outward, and from this point of view, the actor became the ideal repository for such a projection. The male actor, dressed in women's clothing, seemed to lack an inherent gender, and this seemed to make him monstrous. In this way, the fantasy of effeminization, which came to dominate anti theatrical tracts, became a repository for a profound contradiction in the way a certain segment of the English Renaissance saw the self. The idea that a man can be turned into a woman is a version of the more basic magical idea that a given person can be turned into another person. This idea is not explicitly magical. It does not self consciously allude to charm or potions, but it is implicitly so, for it involves a belief in a fairly mysterious process which violates the notion of discrete and individual identity. Anti theatrical tracts are, in fact, dominated by both explicit and implicit claims about magic. Moving ahead from here, Catherine Belsey looks at performativity in gender in a different dispensation, the case of Shakespeare. She points out that recent attention to performativity allows us to distinguish between impersonation as pretense and impersonation as becoming. To a high degree, Shakespeare's fictional girl boys become what they perform. The play allows that there are skills cross dressing cannot automatically inculcate. Viola Cesario cannot fight a duel, since fencing has to be learnt. When Cesario is expected to get out his sword, his alter ego Viola concedes that a little thing would make me tell them how much I lack of a man. The sexual innuendos of sword and a little thing are apparent and explanatory. As the play makes clear, Cesario cannot, in 1601, marry Olivia, although his twin brother, possessed of the crucial little thing, can, to the mutual satisfaction of the parties. But in other respects, most notably fluency, wit, and the power of persuasion, Shakespeare's male impersonators are more than equal to their masculine interlocutors, but they do not lead to fixity. On the contrary, Shakespeare's transvestites move without difficulty between genders, emphasizing the performativity of masculinity and femininity. By the time of As You Like It, the cross dressed role has incorporated a similar dual identification into the action on the stage. In other words, the boy actor plays a woman who disguises herself as a boy, who goes on to impersonate the woman she is for the man she loves. This dramatic strategy is either very risky or very utopian. Either way, the degree of daring is partly obscured in modern productions where, played by a woman, Rosalind easily remains Rosalind even in her cross dressed impersonation of Ganymede. But the body and voice of the boy actor must have held the options open in a way we can barely imagine. Which, an audience might have wondered, is the act and which the reality within the fiction? Or which does the play promote as truth? The passion of the woman or the skepticism of the boy? Perhaps the answer is both. If Shakespeare, by now a highly accomplished dramatist, had discovered the secret of romantic comedy, the play caters for alternative points of view related to romance and laughter. Speech prefixes in the printed text obscure for the reader of Shakespeare the ease with which on the stage, where there are no speech prefixes, the character slips between identifications. This is most evident in As You Like It and Twelfth Night, where Shakespeare has become so at home with the convention he has devised on the basis of the narrative sources that he risks placing it in the center of the action. For example, Viola as Cesario, required to court Olivia on behalf of the man Viola loves, plays the role of a saucy youth, cheeky in a way that adolescent boys then and now are permitted to be. Cesario opens his address to the Countess with a formal speech in conventional praise of Olivia's beauty, as befits a courtly messenger. But since he is not sure which of the veiled women is the proper addressee, he breaks off abruptly. I pray you tell me if this be the lady of the house, for I never saw her. I would be loath to cast away my speech, for, besides that it is excellently well penned, I have taken great pains to con it. Art ought to conceal art. The delivery of the speech should efface the effort of its construction. Orsino's ambassador ought not to have given away that the speech has been written and learned in advance. But boys are indulged in a way that adult ambassadors and young women are not. When Olivia interrupts the speech, Cesario urges plaintively, Alas, I took great pains to study it, and 'tis poetical. So far, we have seen Cesario first as formal courtier and then as the young man who engagingly steps outside that role. But who is it who then goes on to beg Olivia to discard her veil? What motive would Cesario have for a sudden shift to the plain style and a pressing request? Good madam, good madam, let me see your face. Viola, on the other hand, has every reason to want to size up the opposition. Olivia yields and draws the curtain to show the picture with, Is it not well done? Her interlocutor replies, Excellently done, if God did all, playfully suspecting Olivia of cosmetic improvement, at that time fit only for whores. Who is the speaker? Is it the mischievous boy Cesario or the committed rival Viola? And who is speaking in what follows? An admiring boy or a competitor honest enough to acknowledge what her eyes reveal? 'Tis beauty truly blent, whose red and white nature's own sweet and cunning hand laid on. Therefore, we may now turn to Catherine E. Kelly, who argues in The Queen's Two Bodies, Shakespeare's boy actress in breeches, that in foregrounding gender as a cultural performance by relating it metaphorically to the actor's art, the Shakespeare of the comedies not only refused to reinforce the prevailing view of women as fixed and stable entities in the Elizabethan social hierarchy, but invited a critical reading of gender roles as permanent designations of womanhood and manhood. In this reading, the dramatic attention focused on the gap between the boy actress and his fictional female role signifies most powerfully references to personation, the relatively new art of the Elizabethan actor, which entailed close identification between the player and his fictional role. At the beginning of a performance, the audience has an awareness of their artificiality and at the end, a respect for their plausibility. The governing assumptions of self and subjectivity informing this expectation have been lucidly presented by Laura Levine in her discussion of anti theatricality during this period. Encoded Encoded in the ironic reflexivity of the performances is Shakespeare's simultaneous awareness of the limit placed on personating womankind through the body of a boy and a desire to overcome that limit by first focusing the spectator's attention upon it and then seeming to move the actor beyond it. In each of these parts, the actor prepares for the change from woman to boy by flaunting the qualities of the boy actor, sexually coy and verbally exuberant, punning, quick witted, and chiding. But in each of them, he is given language that creates the impression of his growth as a performer, language suggesting a greater depth and complexity of emotion and thought than that which he begins his performance with. So that while the pert boyishness of the performer, including his teasing provocation, is never abundant altogether, it is complemented by, and at moments subsumed to, an intensity of expression through which the boy appears to move from youthful wit to performer of greater maturity. The repeated use of this strategy seems to have distinguished Shakespeare among his contemporaries. In proposing a model of response to the part that presumes an awareness not only of the difference between the actor's sex and the gender of his role, but also of differences within the subjectivity assigned to that role. Kelly assumes that the spectator's acceptance of the provisional reality of the boy heroines did not preclude their ability to tolerate and even to enjoy disruptions of that reality in the form of the actor's self mimesis. So that while the convention of the boy actress was probably accepted without question, it could also have been, at selected moments, utilized in the way Kelly describes it without jeopardizing its status as a convention or ground of expectation. So, the audiences of Twelfth Night saw a boy actor playing the part of Viola, who then disguises herself as a boy called Cesario. Shakespeare's theatre layered gender roles to tantalize audiences, drawing on the virtuosic skill of the highly trained young men, usually aged between 12 and 21, who played these complex female characters. What's perhaps most striking here is that there is no attempt to hide the presence of the boy playing the female role. In fact, attention is drawn to it because the woman's part refers both to the absent female body and the theatrical part of Viola that the boy performs. Such moments revel in the layering of gender identity and disguise. Turning to the relation between gender and class, in Gender, Class and the Social Order, in late Elizabethan drama, Mihoko Suzuki refers to Lisa Jardin's observation that patriarchy's unexpressed worry about the great social changes which characterize the period could be made conveniently concrete in the voluminous and endemic debates about the woman question, and argues that Shakespeare's comedy Twelfth Night dramatizes the convergence of an anxiety about shifts in class relations with an anxiety about instability in gender relations by translating one into the other. Twelfth Night negotiates the twin issues of social mobility and volatile gender relations, reversing the direction of the displacement of categories to translate relations between genders onto relations between classes. For Twelfth Night, gender functions as a more difficult problem than class. Yet, it is also important to remember that Twelfth Night does not allow Olivia's initial desire for Cesario to be fulfilled. Her marriage with Sebastian serves to deflect anxieties concerning not only Olivia's attraction for Viola, disguised as Cesario, but also Orsino's attraction for Cesario, whom he will marry as Viola. Twelfth Night considers the otherness of gender difference to be less surmountable than inequalities in class. Thus, Twelfth Night's comic imperative to conclude with marriages entails an accommodation between the genders. The publication of Juliet Duesenberg's Shakespeare and the Nature of Women has a significance which goes beyond the statement and method of the book itself. As the first full length study of Renaissance drama in the mode of the new feminist criticism, Duesenberg's work is a major step in an important and exciting area of Shakespeare studies. Her thesis is radical and exhilarating that the drama of Shakespeare and his contemporary playwrights, Middleton, Marston, Dekker, Heywood, Johnson, and Chapman, was shaped by a popular feminism, partly social but chiefly cultural, which was bred by the breakdown of old ideas and forms in religion, in politics, and in the structure of late Elizabethan and Jacobean society. It is conventional in studies of women's history to point to the humanistic education of the 16th century as a positive force on the cultural status of aristocratic women. But Duesenberg argues that this educational reform became noticeably middle class in Shakespeare's day. The assurance and wit of Jacobean stage heroines were indeed engendered by a society which taught little girls as well as little boys how to read, write, and argue. But education was less of a force itself than one of the long range effects of the Reformation, which had left a legacy of new attitudes towards marriage. In Shakespeare's insistence on the mutuality of men and women, Duesenberg finds the essential feminist force of the day, the Puritan influence on those London audiences which would not tolerate the assumptions of a debauched aristocracy concerning the double standard and courtly love, and which would not accept a literature which largely ignored the possibility of marriage as a spiritual and physical mating of equal partners. With their emphasis on the sanctity of the married state, the Puritans, wittingly or not, altered the expectations for women's independence of mind. The early 17th century dramatists, writing for a fiercely commercial theatre and for a bourgeois audience which identified with the city and against the court, had to address themselves to these real concerns of their time, concerns which were deeply involved with the question of woman's nature and her relationship with man. For Duesenberg, the theatrical convention of having female roles played by boy actors prompted these playwrights to consider a femininity more durable than that which might be put on or taken off with a suit of clothes, more complex and expansive than that which society often allowed her. The result was a characterization of women as largely vital, sophisticated, and searching. Such a feminism made no laws and significantly changed no social codes, but it did contribute to the genius of Shakespeare, who refused to divide human nature into the masculine and feminine, but observed in the individual woman or man an infinite variety of opposing impulses. Duesenberg concludes that disguise freed the dramatist to explore the nature of women untrammeled by the custom of femininity. Now we come to Mary Free, who describes these characters as boy heroines in her article, Shakespeare's Comedy Heroines, Proto-Feminists or Conformers to Patriarchy. She writes, "Those plucky boy heroines are another matter, or are they? They seem to be active forces in the play, rather than passive creatures waiting to be acted upon. Justification for their actions has traditionally fallen under two generalizations. First, that boys played the woman's part, and second, that disguised as a man permitted the character a greater scope of action. Despite their garb, these boy heroines remain feminine, and the texts call attention not only to their femininity, but to their unnatural transformation. They never really become men at all. The boy heroine's feigned masculinity results from special circumstances and turns the world topsy-turvy. Men create the situation, and the boy heroines react to masculine dictates. And all Viola and Rosalind can wait for is the moment they can become chaste, silent, and obedient wives in good Renaissance fashion. Mary Free has deliberately used the term boy heroine, for each is described as not being a man in the plays. And despite a growing tendency to use woman for girl, the nature of the marking implied by boy and girl tells us something about patriarchal values in the plays. Even the term transvestite heroine implies a social world controlled by an authority other than these heroines. In a world of filial duty and obedience, it's appropriate that we have boys and girls As the world returns to order, it returns to the Renaissance patriarchal values. Shakespeare's most praised female characters are the comedic heroines, but their allure arises from their femininity, not their feminism. And I end on that note. Thank you.
The Merchant of Venus, As You Like It, Cymbeline, Twelfth Night, and a number of other plays have portrayed sexual differences in the Elizabethan era. Professor Jolidas's presentation has highlighted elements of cross-dressing, transgenders, cross-dressing of prostitute women, young boys acting women on stage, which have in one way or the other involved struggle, resistance, and subversion. Taking into consideration the 1579 remark made by Stephen Gosson that theatre effeminized the mind, critics as Laura Levin, Catherine Belzy, Jean Howard have addressed a generation's anxieties about gender and stage, and whether male actors who wore women's clothing could literally adulterate male gender. Our next speaker is Professor Shubhajit Sengupta, Department of English, University of Burdwan. The title of his paper is The Imogen Myth in Cymbeline.
Hello. First of all, let me thank the Shakespeare Society of India for having invited me to speak on Shakespeare. Now, this paper that I'm about to read is one that I wrote a few years ago. It's been published, but I have made certain changes to it. It's a revised version of the published paper. Of course, much remains in common. It's called The Imogen Myth in Cymbeline. Cymbeline, as you will probably agree, is one of those plays by Shakespeare which we don't very often read. Unlike The Tempest, for example, which is another of the last plays, Cymbeline is not generally discussed. It's not very often read. But it's a play that can be quite fascinating, and particularly so this very important figure of Imogen. Now, I'll begin with a passage from Imogen, which the British king, Cymbeline, the play is called Cymbeline, but Cymbeline, the king of Britain, actually has not much of a role to play. But towards the end, Cymbeline is finally united with his children, Imogen, Guiderius, and Arviragus. And once he is reunited with them, he very happily declares, "Oh, what am I, a mother to the birth of three? Ne'er mother rejoiced deliverance more." Act 5, Scene 6. This is a significant passage because, among other things, it points towards a certain ambivalence in the representation of the feminine. This last scene in the play excludes the physical presence of the feminine from the happy union of Britain and Rome, but it doesn't exclude the presence of women, because Imogen, a woman, does appear on the stage in the garments of a page. And yet, the exclusion of the feminine is undercut by the evocation in Cymbeline's speech of the mother, which is a feminine entity. This is symptomatic of the play's disconcerting ambivalence towards the feminine, and in particular towards Imogen. Further, the exclusion of the feminine from this scene suggests patriarchal notions about the dynamics of international relations in King James's England, and the new historicist critic Stephen Greenblatt's statements on James I's aspiration to unite Scotland and England, along with the already incorporated Wales, into a single entity with one church and one set of laws, appear to contribute and strengthen the ideological, quote-unquote, masculine bias with which history itself has so often been articulated. I'm referring to Greenblatt's statements in his notes on Cymbeline in the Norton Shakespeare. Stephen Greenblatt, of course, was the editor of the Norton Shakespeare, which itself is based largely on the Oxford edition, and this is the volume of the Norton Shakespeare which includes the romances and the poems, published in 1997. The exclusion of the feminine from the final scene of Shakespeare's Cymbeline may then be read as a tribute to King James's masculine enterprises. Greenblatt explains Cymbeline's statement about being mother to the birth of three as androgenesis fantasy, defining androgenesis as a fantasy about, and I'm quoting Greenblatt, reproduction without union with women, unquote. Such fantasies within the political circumstances of the final scene are almost an assurance of the dispensability of the feminine. Janet Edelman, too, reads the operation of androgenesis fantasy in Cymbeline's words and interprets them in terms of a primitive masculine desire to annihilate the notion of man's origin in woman, calling man's origin in woman I quote Edelman, a fact that mocks masculine claims to autonomy and supremacy, and thus threatens to undermine the very foundations of patriarchy, unquote. There's a character called Posthumus in the play, and he has a very unflattering, misogynist speech in Act 2, Scene 4, which contemplates the possibility of an exclusively masculine world without the requirement of feminine participation in the process of procreation. And at one point in the speech, he asks, "Is there no way for men to be, but women must be half workers?" He's questioning the role of women and the necessity of their presence in the process of procreation. Later in the speech, the same speech, Posthumus ascribes masculine vices to what he calls the woman's part in man, suggesting the indelibility of Eve's original sin. I'm reading a portion of that speech where he talks about the woman's part. "Could I find out the woman's part in me? For there is no motion that tends to vice in man, but I affirm it is the woman's part. Be it lying, note it, the woman's, flattering, hers, deceiving, hers, ambitions, covetings, change of prides, disdain, nice longing, slanders, mutability, all faults that man can name, nay, that hell knows. Why, hers in part or all, but rather all. For even to vice they are not constant, but are changing still, one vice but of a minute old, for one not half so old as that. This is Act 2, Scene Act 2, Scene 5. Misogynism conspires with androgenesis, fantasies, to exclude women from the formation of the renewed Britain, where, as Cymbeline declares towards the close of the play, I quote Cymbeline, this is from Act 5, Scene 6, a Roman and a British ensign wave, friendly together. Feminist anxieties about disincorporation and subordination of the feminine in Cymbeline are generated, however, by the process initiated when Posthumus and Iachimo lay down the terms of the wager. The action proceeds to displace Imogen, the strong-willed heir to Cymbeline, not only from succession, but also to the margin of the play's ultimate discourse. What Greenblatt calls the decidedly masculine characteristic, 3 words I quote from Greenblatt, of the renewed Britain at the play's end is hard to miss. The heirs to the British throne are now the sons of Cymbeline, and the soothsayer, reading the tablet, interprets the Latin words mollis aer as tender heir, and stretches those Latin words to mulier, which is Latin for wife. While this sanctions the marriage of Imogen and Posthumus, the pun on H-E-I-R, heir, and A-I-R, heir, is too obvious to be missed. As Guiderius and Arviragus disempower and displace Imogen, she sinks from her earlier status as heir, H-E-I-R, to the present ignominy of heir, A-I-R, a status that, in so much as it suggests insubstantiality, recalls the actors in Act 4, Scene 1, the actors referred to in Act 4, Scene 1 of The Tempest, who, I quote from that play, very well-known words, were all spirits and are melted into air, into thin air. The soothsayer's imagination creates mulier out of mollis air, and the linguistic twisting indicates that the relatively more substantial status of wife has to be forced out of what essentially means tender air, A-I-R. And he says, I quote the soothsayer, the piece of tender air, A-I-R, thy virtuous daughter, which we call mollis air, and mollis air, we term it mulier, which mulier I divine is this most constant wife. Act 5, Scene 6. The emergence of wife from tender air, A-I-R, suggests implicitly the exclusion of women from issues of royal lineage, irrespective of the circumstances of biological birth. The soothsayer's linguistic twisting severs Imogen from matters of succession and establishes for her the twin identities of virtuous daughter and most constant wife. These identities, feminine and passive, at once push her to the periphery of the idea of a revitalized Britain that the play's closure generates. Constancy in the wife may, of course, have a link here with the desire for constancy in the sense of political stability in the Britain that the play constructs. Imogen's body as metonymy for the nation is undoubtedly fascinating. It is intriguing that Shakespeare should have allowed his play to subscribe to the politics of exclusion of the feminine from the New Britain, even as he allows for the emblematic status of Imogen's personal or individual body as a signifier of Britain. Given the emblematic quality of Imogen's body, it is unthinkable to imagine a successful assault on her chastity or life. The threats of defilement appear twice. Iachimo attempts to seduce her, and then Cloten, in Posthumus's garments, is determined to rape her. And twice are the attempts foiled. Iachimo's story to Posthumus about having successfully drawn Imogen into debauchery is designed to win the bet and rests on a series of lies that create only an illusion of success. Posthumus's attempt to have her killed is foiled too, as indeed is Imogen's wish for self-slaughter. Now, this paper's most immediate concerns are not the allegorical implications of the play, and references in it to Imogen's body as metonymy for Britain need to be understood only as attempts to take note of the play's repeated counterbalancing of the rejections and exclusions of the feminine with this sustained metonymy. Recognizing ambivalence in the ways in which reconstructions of Imogen, as well as Shakespeare's own methods of representation, signify femininity and the female body, the paper seeks to neutralize feminist anxieties about disincorporation and subordination of the feminine in Cymbeline. Theresa Kemp, author of the book Women in the Age of Shakespeare, published in 2010, offering an argument similar to mine, refers to the rape of Lucrece and Titus Andronicus, and notes that, I quote Kemp, "In Cymbeline, Imogen's body becomes a fetish and signifier of Britain, much like the bodies of Lucrece and Lavinia, the character from Titus Andronicus, which are made metonymies for nation. Thus, the integrity of her chastity and any assaults on it are simultaneously individual and metonymically an attack on Britain." Unquote. Now, this play, Cymbeline, has over the centuries created what I call the Imogen myth, with its own substantial set of epithets. The Frenchman, one of the characters in the play, tells Iachimo of a previous meeting with Posthumus in Orleans, when Posthumus had described Imogen as, I quote, "more fair, virtuous, wise, chaste, constant, qualified, and less attemptable than any of the rarest of our ladies in France." Unquote. This is in Act 1, Scene 5. Posthumus describes her to Iachimo as, I quote, "the gift of the gods," again Act 1, Scene 4, and tells him in the same scene, "my mistress exceeds in goodness the hugeness of your unworthy thinking." Unquote. The second lord, another character in the play, calls her, I quote, "divine Imogen." This is Act 2, Scene 1. And in the same scene goes on to say, "the heavens hold firm the walls of thy dear honour. Keep unshaked that temple thy fair mind." Unquote. Iachimo, despite the lies he speaks about his encounter with Imogen, speaks truthfully when he tells Posthumus, I quote, "your lady is one of the fairest that I have looked upon." Act 2, Scene 4. And later again, when he describes Imogen to Cymbeline in Act 5, Scene 6 as, I quote Iachimo, "that paragon, thy daughter." Unquote. And again in the same scene, "your chaste daughter." Unquote. And Pisanio, another character in the play, thinks that she is, and this is a quote from Act 3, Scene 2, "more goddess-like than wife-like." Unquote. Now, remarks such as these cut in two opposite but related directions. First, they eulogize Imogen as a paragon and godhead of virtuous womanhood. And secondly, they serve as reminders that such extolments are masculine constructs designed to perpetuate patriarchal hegemony through the codification of attributes that man most desires in woman. All the quotes about Imogen that I mentioned are actually spoken by male characters in the play. The extolments then may be read in terms of the male desire for subversion and containment of the feminine, and while they stand at some distance from androgenesis fantasies, they share the latter's vision of a patriarchy threatened by feminine impulses. Simon Palfrey's contention in his book Late Shakespeare, A New World of Words, published in 1997, that the woman's part in the play is, I quote Palfrey, one of ideological disjunction, unquote, may be understood in terms of the ambiguities that underline Imogen's representation. Palfrey's reading of Imogen challenges the the identifications of Imogen with the vague abstraction of what Anne Thompson, in an essay titled Feminist Theory and the Editing of Shakespeare, The Taming of the Shrew Revisited, in a book called Shakespeare, Feminism and Gender, edited by Kate Chedzoy, published in 2001. Anne Thompson, now, Palfrey's reading of Imogen challenges the identification or the identifications of Imogen with the vague abstraction, I repeat, of what Anne Thompson in her essay calls total femininity. Conventional approaches to Imogen have found commendable her stubborn preservation of her chastity, her unquestionable love for her husband, her readiness to obey her husband's orders that she be killed, and her magnanimous acceptance of the loss of her right to the throne. Much has been made, too, of Shakespeare's pun on fidele, F-I-D-E-L-E, and fidel, F-I-D-E-L, or fidelity. And this following snatch from a conversation between Lucius and Imogen, or Fidel, stresses the point. And Lucius asks Imogen, "Thy name?" And Imogen says, "Fidel, sir." And Lucius says, "Thou dost approve thyself the very same. Thy name well fits thy fade, thy name." This is Act 4, Scene 2. And Thompson remarks that Imogen has invited praise for, and I quote Anne Thompson, the domesticity of her figurative language. She refers twice to her needle and her actions such as cooking for her brothers and Belarius, unquote. And recalls the actress Anne Thompson's observations, recall the actress Helen Fawcett's observation that Belarius's cave in the play Cymbeline begins to feel like a home when Imogen begins to inhabit it. Thompson's observation that the Imogen myth became particularly pronounced during the Victorian period suggests that its dissemination served the causes of conservative Victorian attitudes. But myths are vulnerable, and the Imogen myth has been overtaken by dissident readings that see the myth as potentially subversive. Nonconformist attitudes towards the myth derive in large measure from the play's potential to resist patriarchal designs and attitudes. Palfrey offers an extensive set of instances of Imogen's, I quote Palfrey, violent or defiant motives, unquote, to show how the text frequently distances Imogen from what Palfrey calls, I quote him again, from the Swinburnian paragon of grace under pressure, unquote. The disquieting quality of Imogen's defiance of masculine authority, or of the particular masculine authority of her father, coexists with her unquestioning acceptance of another masculine authority, that of her husband. Dissident feminist readings of the play foreground Imogen's defiance of Cymbeline, the active exercise of her choice in selecting Posthumus as her husband, her self-regard, and her hankering after novel adventures that forestall conventional placidities and posit them as central to the play's discourse in a way that seeks to override the feminist anxieties that the play might generate. Imogen's afterlives, made possible in part by the play's potential to open up other visual and gestural texts, have significantly reconstructed her femininity. Several of these revisionist texts privilege the woman's part in the play and resist the negations of female sexuality. And Thomson's brief survey of some radical revisions and expurgations of the text in major 18th century theatrical representations call for attention. And this is a somewhat long passage that I quote from Thomson. Explicit sexual references and references to all but the most innocent parts of the human body were routinely omitted. In the wager scene, that is Act 1, Scene 4, for example, it became standard for Yoshimo to assert that he would win the love, I quote, win the love of Imogen, rather than that he would enjoy her, I quote, dearest bodily part, unquote, which is perhaps what Shakespeare had written. And in the scene in which he returns to Rome, Act 2, Scene 4, it became standard to omit Posthumus's blunt challenge to him to prove, I quote, that you have tasted her in bed, unquote. Posthumus's soliloquy at the end of this scene was often cut, as were Yoshimo's the soliloquy where he talks about the woman's part, a bit of which I read out a little while ago. So that soliloquy was often cut, as were Yoshimo's references to prostitutes in his scene with Imogen. The purpose of Cloten's pursuit of the heroine was altered insofar as references to his intent to rape her were omitted. Unquote. That's what Anne Thompson writes. I was quoting Anne Thompson. Now, Thompson's account, however, overlooks the great actor David Garrick's faithfulness to the Shakespeare original in his influential 1761 version of Cymbeline. There is no readily visible idealization of Imogen in Garrick, but in Posthumus's woman's part speech, he substitutes one line, all faults that man can name, with, I quote, all faults that may be named, unquote. Garrick's version replaced various drastically altered versions that had been current since the Restoration, and the success of the revival of the original Cymbeline led to a series of paintings based on the play. And for a detailed account of paintings from Cymbeline, one may look up a book called Paintings from Books, Art and Literature in Britain, 1760 to 1900, by Richard Daniel Altick, published in 1985. Between 1762 and 1788, these paintings were exhibited at places such as the Society of Artists and at the Royal Academy. Edward Penny's painting, titled Imogen Discovered in the Cave, survives at Stratford-upon-Avon. And Alexander Runciman's 1785 portrayal of Yoshimo showing the horrified Posthumus the supposed proof of Imogen's adultery is at the National Gallery of Scotland. Most of the Cymbeline paintings of the next 100 years attempted to reproduce the drama of sexual conspiracy and Imogen's adventures outside the court, with the focus narrowed down to the scene of Yoshimo's secret invasion of Imogen's bedchamber, the scene where Yoshimo delivers a fabricated report to Posthumus of his encounter with Imogen, and the scenes where Imogen seeks refuge in a cave, receives help from Belarius, Guiderius, and Arviragus, and rises from her drugged sleep to find herself beside the body of the beheaded Cloten, dressed in Posthumus's clothes. Among these are an 1834 painting by F. P. Stepanov. It's titled Yachimo Taking the Bracelet from Imogen. And another painter, William Boxall's study of Imogen, that captures the elegance and the tension of the moment when she puts down her book and prays herself to sleep, unaware that Yachimo is in the trunk. Now, these paintings, with their concentrated focus on Imogen's tribulations and their frequent execution and display in galleries, have served as a counterpoint to literary criticism on the play, which, till the coming of the feminists, had situated Imogen on the margins of discussions, seeing her as the other in the play, seeing her as the other in a play with centralized patriarchal concerns. Imogen's afterlives in these paintings are unique in that they almost isolate her from the story and make her emblematic of the play, drawing her into the center of popular and aesthetic responses, if not of academic literary criticism. Victorian appreciations for Imogen may be traced to Helen Fawcett's, she was an actor, Helen Fawcett's portrayals in 1838 and 1843. At 47 years of age, Fawcett played Imogen once more in an 1864 Drury Lane production, and her performance there encouraged a critic to wax eloquent on, and I quote that critic, that unconscious propriety of Imogen, that innate virtue which guards her as a shield and enfolds her as a garment, that purity of soul which speaks in her slightest movements. Now this quote is to be found in the Royal Shakespeare Company edition of Shakespeare's Cymbeline, published in 2011, edited by Jonathan Bate and Eric Rasmussen and Will Sharp. I refer you now to another famous female actor, Ellen Terry. And Ellen Terry's portrayal of Imogen at the Lyceum in 1896 was as significant as Fawcett's in cementing the character. Several years later, a young Vanessa Redgrave inspired poetic flourishes from theatre critics. While one took note of Miss Redgrave's flaxen beauty, another felt that she gave Imogen a heartfelt honesty and beauty. Yet another spoke of the golden lustre that she gave Imogen's part, and there was yet another who remarked that she strode through the nightmare wonderland like a noble-voiced goddess. The Imogens of Fawcett, Ellen Terry, and Vanessa Redgrave were paragons of virtue. And while they focused audiences and theatre critics' attention on Imogen and redeemed her from the margins to the centre in popular receptions of the play, they were also guilty of perpetuating the Imogen myth. In a letter addressed to the actress Ellen Terry, dated 6th September 1896, and headed The Intelligent Actress's Guide to Cymbeline, Bernard Shaw savagely tore into Shakespeare's Imogen. And I quote a rather long section of this letter that he wrote, Ellen Terry. All I can extract from the artificialities of the play is a double image, a real woman divined by Shakespeare without his knowing it clearly, a natural aristocrat with a high temper and perfect courage, with two moods, a childlike affection and wounded rage, and an idiotic paragon of virtue produced by Shakespeare's views of what a woman ought to be. A person who sews and cooks and reads improving books until midnight and always reserves her holy duty and is anxious to assure people that they must trust her implicitly with their spoons and forks, and is in a chronic state of suspicion of improper behavior on the part of other people, especially her husband, with abandoned females. If I were you, I should cut the part so as to leave the paragon out and the woman in. Unquote. Now, in the letter, which is one of several that he and Terry exchanged on Cymbeline, Shaw recommends severe cuts in the text and advises Terry elaborately on how certain parts of Imogen ought to be acted. And I quote again from Shaw. All this will mean an intolerable load off your memory and off the real side of Imogen. And I will declare in the Saturday Review that your dramatic instinct and delicacy of feeling have never guided you more unerringly than in rescuing the live bits of Imogen from the bombazine trappings of the bishop's wife. Unquote. In suggesting that Terry take the load of the myth off the real Imogen's shoulders, Shaw is actually and effectively contesting patriarchal designs. K.K. Ruthven wrote a book called Feminist Literary Studies and Introduction, which was published in 1984. And Ruthven's binary analysis of male-female relations in terms of self and other is probably useful here, since it suggests possible strategies of androcentric receptions of the play that either eulogized Imogen, as in the theatre, raising her into what I would call a meta-feminine or trans-historical sphere, or pushed her, as in literary criticism, to the very edges. Shaw is suggesting that Imogen be given her due, and in doing so is unwittingly placing his letters to Ellen Terry in a long line of visual and gestural texts that have sought to neutralize androcentric receptions, patriarchal strategies of subversion, and feminist anxieties, and have brought into focus the woman's part in the play in ways that underscore rather than negate or demean female sexuality. Thank you.
Dr. Shubhajit Sengupta's paper has projected the ambivalent presentation of the feminine in Cymbeline, especially in its portrayal of Imogen. Dr. Faruqi's brief introduction has brought out the diversity of Shakespeare's presentation of women characters through figures like Cleopatra, Rosalind, and Miranda, while Professor Dubé mentions one of the very earliest feminist responses to Shakespeare by a female critic, Charlotte Lennox. I would like to conclude this session by thanking Professor Yogesh Dubé and Professor Baran Faruqi for their constant support and encouragement. I would like to thank Professor Jolly Das and Professor Shubhajit Sengupta for giving the event their valuable time. And I will conclude with a special thanks to all the members of SSI, members of the SSI East Zone FB page, and all other viewers who have been constantly encouraging me, supporting me, as well as SSI East Zone's passionate pursuit of Shakespeare studies. Thank you.